I have something you need to read right now, Mr. Whitmore. Annie Carter's voice cut through the wedding ceremony just as the minister turned toward Richard Whitmore and began the question everyone had come to hear. Beside him stood Victoria Langford in an ivory wedding gown, one hand resting on Richard's arm. Her smile had vanished. Two security guards moved toward Annie. She tightened her grip on the paper. "If you don't read it," she said, still trying to catch her breath, "you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The guests began murmuring. Several phones rose above the rows of chairs. Victoria looked at the wedding coordinator, then at the antique gold watch on her wrist. "Get her out of here," she said. "Now." One guard reached Annie first and took hold of her upper arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "No." Annie pulled back. "I came to see Mr. Whitmore. You're trespassing. I know how this looks, but please." The second guard moved in from the other side. Victoria's voice sharpened. "What are you waiting for? Remove her before she causes another scene." The first guard began turning Annie toward the gate. "Stop," Richard had spoken quietly, but the entire lawn heard him. The guard released Annie. Richard stepped down from the platform and walked along the aisle toward her. No one moved. Annie could hear the soft mechanical click of a camera near the reception tent and the quick rhythm of her own breathing. Richard stopped several feet away. "Do I know you, young lady?" "No, sir." "Then why do you believe I'll regret not reading whatever you're carrying?" Annie glanced at Victoria. The bride's face remained composed, but her fingers had closed around the fabric of her gown. "You may have the wrong man," Richard continued. "Or someone may have sent you here to embarrass me." "No one sent me to embarrass you." "Then who sent you?" Annie had rehearsed this moment on the bus. She had planned to explain who she was, where she lived, and why her grandmother had kept a secret for 5 years. Now, with security at her back and strangers staring at her as though she had wandered in from another world, the prepared words disappeared. There was only one name that mattered: Elizabeth Whitmore. Richard's expression changed. It was not dramatic. He did not stagger or raise his voice. The color simply left his face, and for one long second he appeared unable to breathe. Behind him, Victoria said, "Richard, don't." He did not turn around. "What did you say?" "Elizabeth Whitmore," Annie repeated. "Your wife." "My wife is dead." The words sounded practiced, as though he had forced himself to say them many times. Annie swallowed. "That's what you were told." Victoria came down from the platform, lifting the front of her gown to keep it from dragging across the grass. "This is cruel," she said. "Whoever paid you to do this chose the worst possible way." "No one paid me." "Then you're confused." "I'm not confused." Victoria stepped between Annie and Richard. Up close, her expression was no longer calm. "Elizabeth died 5 years ago. There was an accident. There were medical records and a death certificate. You cannot walk into a private ceremony and make claims like this." "I didn't come to make a claim. I came to deliver something." Annie held up the paper. Victoria looked at it as if it might explode. Richard's eyes remained fixed on Annie. "You said Elizabeth sent you?" "Yes, sir." "How?" "She gave this to me yesterday." A murmur moved through the guests. Richard's jaw tightened. "Where?" "I'll tell you after you read it." Victoria gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Richard, this is obviously a trick." Annie looked past her. "My grandmother told me not to hand this to anyone except you." "And who is your grandmother?" Richard asked. "Martha Carter." Recognition flickered across his face. Victoria noticed it. "That name means nothing." "It does to me," Richard said. "Martha worked in our home. She was your head housekeeper for almost 20 years, Annie said. "She worked for Mrs. Whitmore longer than she worked for you." Richard looked again at the folded paper. Victoria reached for his arm. "We have guests waiting. The minister is waiting. We can deal with this after the ceremony." Annie heard the strain behind her polished voice. "No," Annie said, "not after." Victoria turned on her. "You do not decide what happens here." "You're right, he does." Annie looked at Richard. "But he has to read it before he marries you." The insult landed harder than a shout. Victoria's face went still. Richard extended his hand toward Annie, then stopped. Thomas, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, approached from beside the platform. Annie recognized him as the head of security from photographs her grandmother had shown her. "Take the paper," Richard said. Thomas Reed stepped forward. His manner was controlled, but unlike the other guards, he did not touch Annie. Miss, may I have it? She hesitated. My grandmother said only Mr. Whitmore. I'll place it directly in his hand. Annie studied his face, then released the paper. Thomas checked the folded edges without opening it and carried it to Richard. Victoria moved closer. You don't have to entertain this. Richard took the paper. For the first time since Annie had entered the garden, he looked afraid. He unfolded it carefully. Annie watched his eyes move across the first line. My love, stop the wedding immediately. She is the one who hurt me. I am safe now, and you must trust the girl who brought you this letter. Elizabeth. His eyes stopped. His thumb pressed against the bottom corner of the page, where a small blue butterfly had been drawn beneath the signature. The paper began to tremble in his hand. Richard Whitmore looked up at Annie, and the suspicion in his face had been replaced by something far more unsettling. Where is she? He asked. Annie looked at the paper in his hand, then at the guests, watching from both sides of the aisle. Some had lowered their phones. Others were still recording. I'll tell you, she said. But not here. Victoria stepped closer. Richard, listen to yourself. You are standing in front of 200 people asking a stranger where your dead wife is. Richard did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the blue butterfly at the bottom of the page. Elizabeth had drawn the same butterfly on grocery lists, birthday cards, and notes she left beside his coffee. The wings always leaned slightly to the left. One side was larger than the other because she said perfection made drawings look lifeless. No newspaper had ever printed it. It had not appeared in the memorial program or on the stone bearing her name. Where did you get this? He asked. From her. That is not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you until we're somewhere private. Victoria reached for the letter. Richard folded it before she could touch it. Let me see it. No. Her hand remained suspended between them. You believe her? I believe this handwriting. Anyone can copy handwriting. Not this. A murmur passed through the nearest rows. Victoria glanced toward the guests and seemed to remember where she was. She straightened her shoulders. We should take a moment, she said, lowering her voice. Go inside, call the police, and find out who put her up to this. Then we can continue. Annie shook her head. You can't continue. Victoria turned. I wasn't speaking to you. You said that before. It still doesn't change what's written there. The wedding coordinator stood near the platform, holding a clipboard against her chest. The minister had closed his book. No one seemed willing to decide whether the ceremony had ended. Richard looked toward Thomas Reed. Clear the house. Victoria stared at him. What? Ask the guests to leave. You cannot be serious. I said clear the house. Thomas hesitated only a second. Yes, sir. Victoria caught Richard's sleeve. We can postpone for an hour. We do not need to send everyone home because some girl brought a forged note. Richard finally faced her. My wife's name is on that paper. Your late wife. That is what I am trying to determine. The words struck harder than anger. Victoria released his arm. For a moment, her face showed something Annie had not seen before. Not grief, not insult. Fear. It disappeared when an older couple approached from the front row. Senator Bradley, one of Richard's longtime friends, cleared his throat. Richard, is there anything we can do? No. Thank you for coming. The senator gave Annie a brief look, neither friendly nor hostile, then guided his wife toward the reception tent. That movement broke the stillness. Guests began collecting purses and jackets. The quartet packed their instruments while staff members moved among the chairs, asking people to proceed to the shuttle area. Conversations rose in low waves. Annie heard pieces as they passed. Some kind of scam. Did you see his face? I thought the first wife died in Florida. Who is that girl? A woman wearing pearls stopped near Annie. She had been one of Elizabeth's friends years earlier, though Annie did not know that. What did she say in the letter? The woman asked Richard. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. That is private. The woman nodded, then looked at Annie. Young lady, I hope you understand what you've started. Annie met her eyes. I didn't start it. The woman seemed ready to argue, but her husband touched her elbow and led her away. Victoria watched the guests leave as though each departing person carried away a piece of the life she had prepared. The cake waited beneath the tent. Champagne glasses stood untouched. A banner with her new last name hung above the dance floor. She turned back to Richard. At least let me come inside. No, I am supposed to be your wife. Not today. Because of 5 lines on a piece of paper? Because of who wrote them. Victoria's face tightened. Elizabeth is dead. Annie saw Richard flinch. Victoria saw it too, but continued. You identified her belongings. You signed the documents. You buried her. This girl is using your grief because she knows you never recovered. Richard stepped closer to her. How would she know about the butterfly? Victoria's answer came too quickly. It could have been in a photograph. It wasn't. Then Martha told her. Why would Martha know? Victoria opened her mouth, but Richard cut her off. Martha did not handle our private correspondence. She had no reason to know what Elizabeth drew at the bottom of letters she wrote to me. Annie noticed Victoria's eyes shift toward the house. It was a small movement, but it made Annie wonder whether Victoria was calculating which door she needed to reach first. Richard noticed it too. Thomas, he said. The security chief returned from directing staff toward the driveway. Have someone stay with Miss Langford. Victoria's expression changed. You're assigning a guard to me? I'm asking you to remain here until I understand what is happening. You have no right to hold me. You are free to leave. You are not free to enter my study or Elizabeth's rooms. The use of Elizabeth's name unsettled her more than the order itself. Victoria drew herself up. You are humiliating me. Richard looked over the emptying lawn. This is not about humiliation. It is for me. Annie had expected Richard to comfort her. Instead, he said, if that letter is false, I will deal with the person responsible. If it is true, humiliation will be the least of our concerns. He turned to Annie. Come with me. Richard led her through the French doors and into the house. Annie followed, aware of the polished floor beneath her dusty shoes. Family portraits lined the hallway, but none of them showed Elizabeth. Victoria had removed nearly every trace of her. Richard entered a study at the rear of the house and locked the door behind them. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and the cedarwood cologne he wore. He remained standing. Start with your name. Annie Carter. How old are you? 18. And Martha Carter is your grandmother? Yes. When did she leave our household? 4 years ago. Richard frowned. She left a year after the accident. She left because someone kept asking questions about what she saw that night. Who? She never knew his name. Why didn't she come to me? Annie held his gaze. Because she didn't know whether she could trust you. He looked away as though the answer had struck him physically. Annie continued before he could interrupt. My grandmother found Mrs. Whitmore near the Marsh Road after the crash. She was alive, but badly hurt. Before Grandma could call for help, another car arrived. 2 men got out and searched the wreck. Richard's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. What did they say? One of them said they wouldn't be paid if she was still alive. Richard's face hardened. And Martha took her? She hid her until they left. Then she brought her home. For 5 years? She couldn't remember much at first. Sometimes she didn't know her own name. Later, pieces came back. She tried to contact you, but the letters never reached you. Richard touched the pocket holding the note. Where is she now? At my grandmother's house. He stared at Annie, searching for hesitation and finding none. Is she safe? For the moment. What does that mean? It means Mrs. Whitmore saw the wedding announcement 3 days ago and recognized Victoria. She remembered who caused the crash. If Victoria knows she's alive, my grandmother's house won't stay safe for long. Richard moved toward the door. Thomas. Annie caught his arm. He looked down at her hand, and she released him. You can't tell everyone where we're going. I have a security team, and someone helped Victoria for 5 years. He went still. For the first time since they entered the study, Richard seemed to understand that the danger did not end at the gate. He opened the door and called Thomas inside. Bring the car around, Richard said. Just one, no driver. Thomas looked from Richard to Annie. Where are we going? Richard placed a hand over the letter in his pocket. To see my wife. If this moment touched your heart, please like the video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Thomas drove the black SUV himself. Richard sat in the passenger seat, while Annie took the rear seat behind him. No second vehicle followed them. No driver had been told where they were going. The gates of the Whitmore estate opened, and the wedding disappeared behind a line of live oaks. For several minutes, no one spoke. Richard removed the letter from his pocket and read it again. His thumb rested near the blue butterfly. Why yesterday? He asked. She didn't remember everything at once, Annie said. Some days she remembered names, Other days she only remembered places or sounds. When she saw the report about your wedding, something changed. What report? It was on the evening news. They showed Victoria standing beside you outside the courthouse. Richard looked through the windshield. We were picking up the marriage license. Mrs. Whitmore dropped her cup when she saw her. Thomas glanced at Annie in the mirror. What exactly did she remember? She said Victoria was in the car with her before the crash. Then she started talking about a meeting, missing money, and someone touching the brakes. Richard turned halfway in his seat. Victoria was in the car? Earlier that day, not when it crashed. Did Elizabeth say where they met? No. She gets headaches when she tries to remember too much. Richard faced forward again. The SUV crossed from the quieter roads near the estate into heavier traffic. Charleston moved around them in late afternoon light. Tour buses passed restored homes near the historic district. Couples walked beneath shop awnings. Delivery trucks blocked one lane near a restaurant. Annie watched Richard study streets he had likely driven through hundreds of times without noticing much beyond the buildings bearing his company's name. They passed the glass offices of Whitmore Holdings. The company logo rose above the entrance in steel letters. Richard looked at it, then down at the letter. Did Martha ever call the police? She almost did. Almost? The night she found Mrs. Whitmore, she drove toward the county hospital. Before she reached the main road, Mrs. Whitmore woke up and started screaming for her not to go there. She was confused. She was terrified. That isn't the same thing. No, sir, it isn't. Thomas changed lanes, leaving the business district behind. Richard turned toward Annie again. Tell me what happened that night. Everything your grandmother told you. Annie looked out the window. She had heard the story in pieces over 5 years, usually after Elizabeth fell asleep or woke from another nightmare. My grandmother had worked late at the estate. There was a charity dinner, and Mrs. Whitmore left before the staff finished cleaning. I remember the dinner, Richard said. I was in New York. Annie nodded. Grandma drove home on the Marsh Road because traffic was backed up on the highway. She saw broken glass near the shoulder, then tire marks leading down the embankment. Richard's jaw tightened. The car was upside down near the reeds. Grandma climbed down and found Mrs. Whitmore outside the passenger side. She must have crawled through a broken window. Was she conscious? Barely. She had blood on her face and couldn't move one arm. Thomas kept both hands on the wheel. Martha should have called 911. She reached for her phone. Then headlights appeared. Richard looked at Annie. A dark sedan stopped above the embankment. She continued. 2 men got out. Grandma thought they had come to help, so she was about to call to them. Then she heard one of them say they needed to make sure Mrs. Whitmore was still inside the car. Thomas's eyes shifted toward the mirror again. What else? Richard asked. The other man said, if she's alive, Langford won't pay us. The interior of the SUV seemed to grow smaller. Richard stared ahead. Martha heard Victoria's name clearly. She heard Langford. That could mean someone else. Annie studied the back of his head. How many people named Langford had a reason to want your wife dead? Thomas spoke before Richard could answer. Let her finish. Richard gave him a hard look, then faced Annie again. What did Martha do? She pulled Mrs. Whitmore into the reeds and covered her with her coat. The men searched the car. One of them climbed halfway down the embankment, but a truck came along the road, so they left. Did she get a license plate? No. She was trying to keep your wife from making a sound, and then she waited. When the road was quiet, she helped Mrs. Whitmore into her Buick and drove away. Richard frowned. Martha owned that brown LeSabre? You remember it? She drove it for years. Elizabeth kept telling her to replace it. Grandma said the car saved both of them because nobody noticed an old Buick. Thomas turned onto a narrower road lined with small homes, churches, laundromats, and family-owned stores. Men sat outside a barber shop. An elderly woman watered potted plants on a porch. A handwritten sign outside a Baptist church announced a fish fry on Friday. Richard looked through the window. I thought Martha moved to Georgia after she left us. That's what she wanted people to think. Who asked questions about her? She never knew. A man came to the diner where she worked and showed her a photograph of Mrs. Whitmore. Another one waited outside our house for 2 nights. Why didn't she come to me then? Annie let out a slow breath. You keep asking that, because I need to understand. She didn't know who arranged the accident. She didn't know who controlled your phone or who opened your mail. All she knew was that someone with money had replaced the truth before the police arrived. Richard looked down at his hands. Annie continued more quietly. Grandma spent 20 years serving your family. She trusted Mrs. Whitmore. She wasn't sure she could trust the people around you. Or me. Yes. Thomas reduced his speed as the road narrowed further. Richard's voice hardened. I would never have hurt Elizabeth. I believe you. He looked back at her. But my grandmother didn't have the luxury of believing, Annie said. She had an injured woman in her house and men searching for her. She had to decide what was safest, not what was polite. Richard turned away. They passed a corner grocery store and a row of brick apartments. Children played basketball beside a chain-link fence. An older man waved at Annie when he recognized her through the window. Richard noticed, people here know you. They know my grandmother. She's been helping half this block since before I was born. With what? Meals, rides to church, medicine pickups, whatever somebody needs. Richard gave a faint nod. Elizabeth used to say Martha could run a city better than most mayors. Annie almost smiled. Grandma would say that isn't much of a compliment. Thomas turned onto a street shaded by pecan trees. Richard folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. What condition is Elizabeth in now? She walks on her own most days. Her right hand still shakes. Loud noises bother her. Sometimes she wakes up thinking she's back in the car. Does she remember me? Annie paused. Richard looked over his shoulder. Please. She always remembered how she felt about you, even when she couldn't remember your full name. He closed his eyes for a moment. When her memory was bad, Annie continued, she called you the man who brought her coffee before sunrise. A sound escaped Richard that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. She hated making coffee. She still does. Thomas slowed near a small blue house with white trim. The porch railing needed paint. Flower pots lined the steps, and an American flag hung beside the front door. Martha's old Buick sat beneath a pecan tree. Thomas stopped at the curb. Richard did not move. Behind a thin curtain in the front window stood a woman with one hand pressed to her chest. Her hair was shorter and streaked with gray. A pale scar ran from her temple toward her cheek. 5 years had changed her face, but not the way she leaned forward when she was afraid to hope. Richard opened the door before Thomas had turned off the engine. Elizabeth, he whispered. Richard crossed the sidewalk before Thomas could stop him. Annie followed at a slower pace, giving him room as he climbed the porch steps. The front door opened before he reached it. Martha Carter stood in the doorway wearing a gray cardigan over a flowered blouse. Age had bent her shoulders, but not her posture. For one moment, she looked at Richard as if he were still the younger man who used to return from business trips with his tie loose and his mind somewhere else. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Richard stopped. Martha. Her eyes moved past him to Thomas, then to Annie. You brought him straight here? There wasn't time, Annie said. Martha looked toward the window behind her. No. I suppose there wasn't. Richard's voice shook. Is that really her? Martha did not answer the question. She stepped aside. Come in. The house was small and warm. A pot of chicken soup simmered in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee lingered in the hallway. A wooden clock ticked above a shelf lined with framed family photographs. Richard noticed one of Annie at a school ceremony, another of Martha standing outside the Whitmore estate many years earlier, and a third showing Elizabeth seated at the Carter kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders. He moved toward the living room. Elizabeth stood beside the window. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. She was thinner than Richard remembered. Her hair, once dark brown, was shorter now, and threaded with gray. A pale scar ran along her left temple, and her right hand trembled against the back of a chair. Yet he knew her. He knew the slight tilt of her head when she was afraid. He knew the way her mouth tightened before she cried. He knew the small crease between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she tried to decide whether to speak or remain silent. Richard, she said. He stopped in the middle of the room. The sound of his name and her voice emptied the strength from his face. He seemed unable to move until Elizabeth lifted her left hand. He crossed the distance between them and dropped to his knees. Richard took her hand but did not pull her toward him. He looked at her fingers, her wrist, the faint mark near her thumb from an old kitchen burn. His breathing became uneven. I buried you, he said. Elizabeth's eyes filled. I know. I stood beside a grave. I know. I thought you were gone. I'm sorry. Richard shook his head. Don't apologize for surviving. She touched his cheek. That was enough. Richard leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her waist. Elizabeth bent over him, pressing her face into his hair. Neither of them cried loudly. The sound was quieter than that, broken breaths from two people who had spent 5 years grieving different versions of the same loss. Annie looked away. Martha touched her arm and guided her toward the kitchen. Thomas remained near the front door, his attention moving between the windows and the street. In the kitchen, Martha lowered the flame beneath the soup. You did what she asked? She said. Yes. And Victoria saw the letter? So did everyone at the wedding. Martha closed her eyes. Then we may not have much time. Annie looked toward the living room. He needed to see her. I know. Do you think he believes us? He believes his own eyes. That is usually where powerful men begin. Martha poured coffee into 3 mismatched cups. One of them was white with faded blue letters that read World's Best Boss. Richard entered the kitchen a few minutes later with Elizabeth beside him. He kept one hand beneath her elbow, though she did not appear to need help. His eyes fell on the cup. Elizabeth gave you that. Martha said it in front of him. She said you never noticed what cup you used as long as there was coffee in it. Richard ran his thumb over the faded words. She was right. Elizabeth sat at the table. Annie pulled out the chair beside her. Richard remained standing. I need to know what happened. Martha gave him a measured look. You need to sit down first. I don't want soup. I did not ask if you wanted soup. For the first time since entering the house, something in Richard's face softened. He sat. Martha served 5 bowls and placed a plate of biscuits in the center of the table. Thomas refused at first, but Martha pointed to the empty chair near the door. You can watch the street while you eat. Thomas obeyed. For several minutes, the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the ticking clock in the hall. Richard barely touched his food. Elizabeth held the warm cup between both hands. I remembered the wedding announcement 3 days ago, she began. Not everything, just her face and the sound of her voice. Victoria's? Elizabeth nodded. She came to see me the morning of the accident. We argued about money missing from the foundation accounts. Richard frowned. What money? Transfers to companies that did not exist. Property purchases, consulting fees. I found Henry Cole's authorization on several of them. Henry? He helped cover the trail. Richard leaned back as if the chair had shifted beneath him. Henry handled the accident reports. I know. And the identification. I know. Thomas lowered his spoon. Elizabeth continued. Victoria said I was confused. Then she said you would never believe I understood the finances better than the people running your company. I would have believed you. You were in New York. I would have come home. She knew that. That is why she made sure I could not call you. Richard looked at the scar along Elizabeth's temple. The brakes? I remember pressing the pedal and feeling nothing. After that, there are only pieces. Martha took over. I found her near the wreck. 2 men came looking. I heard the Langford name. Richard turned to her. Why didn't you contact me? Martha did not answer at once. Because I did not know whether the danger stopped with Victoria, she said. Mrs. Whitmore had been declared dead before I could even understand what happened. The papers reported a confirmed identification. The funeral arrangements began. Men came asking questions in this neighborhood. You thought I was involved. I thought someone near you was. That isn't the same thing. No, sir. But when a frightened woman is lying in your spare room with broken ribs and no memory, the difference does not feel large enough to risk her life. Richard looked down at the coffee. I would never have harmed her. Martha's expression remained calm. I believe that now. Now? Because you left your wedding to come here. The words settled over the table. Elizabeth reached for Richard's hand. I tried to contact you later. When? About a year after the accident. Martha mailed 2 letters from different post offices. I never received them. I called your office once, Henry answered. Richard's fingers tightened around hers. What did he say? That you wanted no more calls about the accident. He said people had been trying to exploit your grief. Richard stared at the wall. He controlled my correspondence after you died, he said. Victoria said I needed distance from the press. Elizabeth's voice was gentle. They built walls around you while you were too hurt to notice. Richard closed his eyes. For years, he had believed wealth gave him access to every answer. Now he sat in a narrow kitchen and understood that money had only allowed other people to manage what reached him. A car slowed outside. Thomas rose at once and moved to the window. Gray sedan, he said. No front plate visible. Annie stood. I saw one like that near the church last week. The car remained at the end of the block long enough for someone inside to raise a phone toward the house. Then it drove away. Richard pushed back his chair. I'm moving Elizabeth somewhere secure. No, Elizabeth said. He looked at her. They know where you are, and your security team may already be compromised. Thomas is here. One loyal man does not make an entire system safe. Richard turned toward Thomas. Thomas did not argue. Martha folded her hands on the table. This house kept her alive for 5 years because no one important thought to look closely at it. That protection is gone now, Richard said. Then we plan before we move. Richard paced once across the kitchen, then stopped beside Elizabeth. I cannot lose you again. You will not protect me by making decisions without me. He looked at her, and something old passed between them. Elizabeth had always been the one person who spoke to him without fear of his position. At last, he nodded. Then we investigate quietly. Thomas said, I'll start with the accident file and the estate security records. No one outside this room, Richard said. Martha looked at him over the rim of her glasses. That includes your lawyers. Richard thought of Henry. Yes, he said. Especially my lawyers. Outside, the gray sedan turned onto another street. Inside it, a man checked the photograph he had taken through the front window, then placed a call. She's alive, he said. After a pause, he added, and Whitmore is with her. Thomas waited until the sedan disappeared before stepping away from the window. Someone found us faster than I expected, he said. Richard looked toward the front door. Can you trace the plate? Not if there wasn't one. There was a phone in the driver's hand, Annie said. He took a picture. Elizabeth tightened her fingers around the coffee cup. Richard noticed. You're not staying here tonight. Martha stood and carried the soup bowls to the sink. We already discussed that. We discussed it before someone photographed the house. And if we rush out now, we may lead them exactly where they want us to go. Richard started to answer, but Thomas interrupted. She's right. Moving without a secure destination creates another risk. Richard turned on him. Then find one. I will. First, I need to know how wide this goes. Thomas took out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Richard remained beside Elizabeth, one hand resting on the back of her chair as though contact with the wood could keep her from disappearing again. Annie helped Martha clear the table. The ordinary movement felt strange after the warning outside. Martha wrapped the leftover biscuits in foil and placed the soup in the refrigerator as if people watching the house were only another problem to handle before bedtime. Richard watched her. You're very calm. I have had 5 years to practice being afraid without showing it. The answer silenced him. Thomas returned a few minutes later. The original accident file is incomplete. Richard frowned. How do you know already? I called a retired deputy who worked traffic investigations that year. He remembers the case because your office sent attorneys before sunrise. My office? That was his wording. Who signed the request? He doesn't remember, but he said the county transferred copies to Whitmore Council. Henry, Elizabeth said. Thomas nodded. Most likely. Richard took out his phone. Elizabeth reached across the table and covered his hand before he could place the call. Don't. I'm asking Henry what he knows, and giving him time to decide what story to tell. He has worked for me for 23 years. So did Martha, Elizabeth said. Yet when she disappeared from your life, no one asked why. Richard lowered the phone. Martha closed the refrigerator door. I did not disappear. I resigned. You left without speaking to me. I wrote a letter. I never saw one. Martha gave him a look that required no explanation. Richard placed the phone on the table. Annie leaned against the counter. Who handled your mail after the accident? Henry's office screened legal matters. Victoria managed most personal correspondence. And your calls? My assistant. Who hired the assistant? Richard's expression changed. Victoria recommended her. No one spoke for a moment. The room had not become colder, but Richard rubbed his hands together as if it had. Thomas sat at the far end of the table. We should review the timeline. No assumptions. Only what each person knows. Richard nodded once. Elizabeth looked down at her cup. The charity dinner ended around 9. I left the estate shortly after. I was in New York, Richard said. My flight was scheduled for the next morning. Victoria came to the library before I left. She said there had been accounting errors. Did she admit taking money? No. She said the transfers were temporary. What transfers? Payments from the Whitmore Foundation to consulting companies. The companies shared mailing addresses and had no employees. Thomas asked, "Did you save copies?" "I printed several pages. I also copied files onto a small drive." Richard leaned forward. "Where is it?" Elizabeth pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Martha moved closer. "Do not force it." "I'm not forcing her. You are asking like a man in a boardroom." Richard looked at Elizabeth and softened his voice. "Do you remember where you put the drive?" "Not yet." "I remember holding it. I remember a blue light on the end." Then Victoria was standing in the doorway. "Was Henry there?" "No." "Did Victoria threaten you?" Elizabeth stared at the grain of the table. "She told me I had no idea how much damage I could cause. She said the foundation, the company, and our marriage would all collapse if I spoke before she fixed it." Richard's jaw tightened. "You believed her?" "I believed she was desperate." "What happened after the meeting?" "I drove away." At the first stop sign, the brake pedal felt soft. Thomas asked, "Did you call anyone?" "I tried, Richard. The call dropped. I had no missed call." "I know." Annie looked at Richard. "Could someone have removed it from your phone records?" "Not from the carrier records," Thomas answered instead. "They could if the account was controlled by corporate security." Richard turned toward him. "Was it?" "After the kidnapping threat in Atlanta, all executive lines were placed under company management." "Who approved access?" Thomas held his gaze. "You did." The admission landed differently from the others. Richard had not merely been deceived. He had signed away access to parts of his own life because efficiency had seemed safer than inconvenience. Elizabeth watched him absorb it. "You were grieving before I was even gone," she said. "You had spent years letting other people stand between you and anything difficult. That sounds like blame." "It is not blame. It is the truth." Richard stood and walked to the window. Across the street, a boy bounced a basketball against a cracked driveway while an older man repaired a porch step. No one outside seemed aware that the dead wife of one of Charleston's richest men was sitting behind a curtain 20 feet away. "I thought paying competent people meant problems were handled," Richard said. Annie folded her arms. "Handled for whom?" He looked back at her. She continued. "People with money think a system works because it works around them. That doesn't mean it works for everyone else." Richard might have rejected the remark an hour earlier. Now he looked toward Elizabeth Scarr and said nothing. A knock sounded at the front door. Thomas moved first, drawing his jacket aside to reach the holster at his waist. Martha raised a hand. "That will be Mrs. Green." "Who is Mrs. Green?" Richard asked. "My neighbor." "You're expecting her?" "She brings my mail when the carrier leaves it at the wrong house." Thomas checked through the curtain before opening the door. An elderly black woman stood on the porch holding a paper grocery bag. She wore a church hat even though it was not Sunday. "Martha, I brought your sweet potatoes," she said, then noticed Thomas, "and apparently half the federal government. I'm private security." Thomas replied. Mrs. Green looked past him and saw Richard. Her eyebrows rose. "Well, that explains the car hiding near the corner." Thomas stepped closer. "You saw it?" "Gray sedan. Man inside pretending to read a newspaper upside down." Annie almost smiled. "Did you see the driver?" Thomas asked. "White man, maybe 40, scar near his right ear. I wrote down the last 3 numbers before he drove away." She reached into the grocery bag and pulled out the back of a pharmacy receipt. Thomas took it. Richard looked at her. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Green studied him. "You're Elizabeth's husband." Richard's face tightened. "Yes. She spoke well of you." He glanced toward the kitchen doorway, where Elizabeth stood. Mrs. Green saw her, gave a small nod, and said nothing more. In East Side, some questions were not asked on a porch. After she left, Thomas entered the partial plate number into a secure database. "It belongs to a fleet registered to Coal Risk Management." Richard turned. "Coal? Henry's brother owns the company." The room went still. Richard reached for his phone again, but this time he did not call Henry. He switched it off and placed it face down. Thomas's own phone rang before anyone could speak. He answered, listened, then looked at Richard. "The county archive was accessed this afternoon." "By whom?" "A courier with authorization from Whitmore Legal." Elizabeth closed her eyes. Thomas continued. "The accident photographs, the mechanic's report, and the original witness statements are gone." Richard stared at the dark screen of his phone. For the first time, He stopped asking whether someone close to him had betrayed him. The only question left was how many of them had. Thomas copied the archive access record onto an encrypted drive, then closed his laptop. Whoever took those files knew exactly what to remove, he said. They left insurance forms, towing receipts, and public reports. Everything that could challenge the official version is gone. Richard stood by the kitchen table, staring at the phone he had switched off. Henry would know that taking the originals creates a trail. He may believe the trail leads back to you, Thomas said. The courier used Whitmore authorization. Annie looked at Richard. Can someone make it look like you ordered it? With access to our legal system, yes. Then turning off your phone won't be enough. Richard nodded. I need a device that isn't connected to the company. Martha opened a drawer beneath the counter and removed an old flip phone. Annie stared at it. Grandma, that thing belongs in a museum. It makes calls. Does it even have service? I keep minutes on it for hurricanes. She handed it to Richard. He accepted the phone with the care of a man receiving a piece of evidence. No one knows this number? He asked. The pharmacy and Mrs. Green. That may be the safest communication line I have. Martha gave him a dry look. That should trouble you. It did. Thomas moved into the living room to contact two people he trusted outside Whitmore Holdings. Richard remained in the kitchen with Elizabeth while Annie checked the locks on the back door. Elizabeth sat with her eyes closed, two fingers pressed against her right temple. Richard lowered himself into the chair beside her. Is the headache getting worse? It comes when I try to hold too many memories at once. We can stop. We lost 5 years because other people decided what I was allowed to know. I don't want to stop now. Richard reached for her hand but waited until she turned her palm upward. The missing drive, he said. You remembered holding it before Victoria entered the library. Elizabeth nodded. Could it still be at the estate? I don't know. Try to think about what happened before you left. Martha set a glass of water beside Elizabeth. Slowly, Elizabeth drank, then looked toward the shelf of family photographs. Her gaze settled on a picture of Annie at 12 years old, holding a small music box. Where did that come from? Annie followed her eyes. You gave it to me. No, not that one. Elizabeth pointed. The shape. The box in the photograph was painted with yellow flowers. A small metal butterfly served as the latch. Richard leaned forward. You had a music box in your sitting room. Elizabeth's breathing changed. It was blue, she said, with a butterfly on top. I bought it in Savannah. You said the tune was annoying. It played every time I opened the cabinet. A faint smile crossed her face, then disappeared. I put something beneath it. The drive? I remember removing the lining. Richard turned to Thomas as he re-entered the kitchen. There's a music box in Elizabeth's old sitting room. Blue enamel, silver butterfly on the lid. She may have hidden the drive inside. Thomas took out his keys. I'll go back to the estate. No, Elizabeth said. He stopped. Victoria will expect Richard to search the house. She may already be there. The estate is still under my security control, Thomas replied. Is it? Annie asked. Thomas looked at her. She continued. Somebody used company authorization to empty the archive. Somebody found this house. We don't know who is giving orders to the guards at the estate. Richard turned to Thomas. Who stayed behind after we left? 6 officers, 2 at the gate, 2 in the main house, and 2 rotating the grounds. Who hired them? My office, but the contracts went through legal. Henry again, Annie said. Thomas did not disagree. Richard walked to the window. The street appeared quiet now, but he no longer trusted quiet. I can call the estate manager, he said, and ask whether anyone stole evidence, Annie replied. That warning will reach Victoria before you hang up. Richard looked at her. What do you suggest? Check the cameras without telling anyone what you're looking for. Thomas nodded. I can access the security system remotely, but not from here. If the account is monitored, it would expose this location. Mrs. Green's earlier words returned to Annie. The church. Martha understood first. Pastor Green keeps a computer in the office. The network isn't connected to Whitmore, Annie said. And it's 2 blocks away. Thomas can walk there without moving the car. Richard looked unconvinced. Using a church computer to access private surveillance footage? Pastor Green has done stranger things for people in trouble, Martha said. He once helped a man file his taxes during a funeral reception. Thomas slipped his laptop into its case. It will work. Annie went with him. The sun had dropped below the rooftops. leaving East Side under porch lights and the glow of corner stores. Several neighbors were still outside, watching unfamiliar cars without appearing to do so. At New Promise Baptist Church, Pastor Samuel Green was locking the fellowship hall when Annie called his name. He was in his late 60s, with rolled shirt sleeves and reading glasses hanging from his collar. "Your grandmother all right?" he asked. "For now. We need to use your internet." He looked at Thomas. "For something legal?" Thomas paused. "For something necessary." Pastor Green considered that answer, then unlocked the office. Those are not always the same thing. The room smelled of old books and floor polish. A plate covered in foil sat beside the computer. "Mrs. Green left pound cake," the pastor said. "Don't get crumbs in the keyboard." Thomas connected his laptop through the church network and entered the security portal. The estate cameras appeared one by one. The wedding lawn was empty. Staff members cleared glasses beneath the reception tent. Delivery workers carried unopened wine back toward a truck. Thomas selected the hallway outside Elizabeth's former sitting room. At 4:46 p.m., 12 minutes after Richard left the estate, Victoria entered the frame. She had changed out of her wedding gown and wore a dark coat over a white slip. Henry Cole followed her. Annie leaned closer to the screen. Victoria unlocked the sitting room door with a key. "Why was it locked?" Annie asked. "Richard ordered the room preserved after Elizabeth died," Thomas said. "Only he and I had keys." "Apparently not." Thomas moved to the next camera. The sitting room had no interior surveillance, but another camera covered the staircase. 7 minutes later, Henry came down carrying a leather document case. Victoria followed with a blue music box beneath her arm. "There," Annie said. Thomas froze the image. The box matched Elizabeth's description: blue enamel, faded gold trim, a silver butterfly fixed to the lid. Thomas checked the gate cameras. Victoria's car left at 5:03. Henry departed 3 minutes later in another vehicle. "Can you tell where they went?" Annie asked. "Not from the estate system." Thomas downloaded the footage, but a warning appeared before the transfer completed. "Remote session terminated by administrator." The camera feeds vanished. "They know someone accessed it," Annie said. Thomas disconnected the laptop. "Yes." Pastor Green stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked from the blank screen to Annie. "Should I ask?" "Not yet," she said. He handed her a cup anyway. "Then take this. Trouble is easier to face when you're warm." By the time Annie and Thomas returned to Martha's house, Richard was waiting at the door. Thomas showed him the downloaded still image before explaining the interrupted connection. Richard studied Victoria carrying the music box. "She knew where Elizabeth hid something," he said. "Or she discovered it while searching," Thomas replied. Elizabeth stood behind them, looking at the image. There was more than a drive. Everyone turned toward her. She touched the scar near her temple. "I put a key beneath the lining." Richard held up the screen. "A key to what?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, searching through memories that had returned without order. "A bank," she said at last. "A safe deposit box under my maiden name." Thomas asked, "Which bank?" "I don't remember." Annie looked again at the butterfly on the music box. "Then Victoria may not know either." Richard folded the old flip phone into his palm. "But she has the key." Outside, a vehicle passed slowly without stopping. Inside, Elizabeth looked toward the dark window and spoke in a voice that carried no uncertainty. "Then we find the bank before she does." By sunrise, Victoria had already changed the story. The first news alert appeared on Annie's phone while Martha was making oatmeal in the kitchen. "Bride to be abandoned after wedding disruption." A second alert followed before Annie finished reading the first. "Mystery teen claims billionaire's late wife is alive." The television in the living room showed Victoria standing outside the Whitmore estate in a navy dress, her wedding makeup removed and her hair pulled back. The flower arch was still visible behind her, along with workers dismantling rows of chairs. Reporters crowded the driveway. Victoria kept one hand near her throat and spoke in a soft voice that forced everyone to listen. "Richard is grieving," she said. "He has carried the loss of his wife for 5 years. Yesterday, a young woman took advantage of that pain during a private family ceremony." Annie stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. Victoria continued, "I do not blame Richard. He was shocked. Anyone who loved him would understand how vulnerable he was in that moment." A reporter asked whether the letter was genuine. "I have not seen any evidence that it was," Victoria replied. "What I saw was a frightened man confronted with a cruel story and a stranger who refused to explain herself. That's a lie, Annie said. Richard entered from the hallway. He had not slept. His tuxedo shirt was gone, replaced by a plain white button-down Martha had found in a donation box for the church. The sleeves were too short. He looked at the television without speaking. Another reporter asked whether Victoria believed Annie wanted money. I cannot speculate about motive, Victoria said, but people have tried to exploit Richard before. The screen changed to footage from the wedding. Annie appeared at the end of the aisle, shouting and holding up the letter. The clip ended before Victoria ordered the guards to remove her. The next image was Annie's school photograph. Her full name appeared beneath it. Annie Carter, 18, East Side resident. Martha turned off the television. That was enough, she said. Annie stared at the dark screen. How did they get my school picture? Richard took out Martha's flip phone. I'll call the station. And say what? Annie asked. That your dead wife is alive in my grandmother's living room? He stopped. Martha placed a bowl on the table. Eat before you decide anything. I'm not hungry. That has never stopped you before. Annie almost argued, but her phone began ringing. The name of the diner manager appeared on the screen. She stepped onto the back porch to answer. Hi, Mr. Lewis. Annie. His voice sounded tired. You seen the news? Yes. I've had 6 calls since we opened. 2 people said they won't come back if you're working. I haven't done anything. I know that. Then tell them. There was a pause. I have 4 employees and rent due next week. Annie looked across the yard at the sagging fence Martha had been planning to repair. So what are you saying? I'm asking you to take a few days off, just until this settles. Paid? Another pause answered the question. Annie closed her eyes. I worked double shifts when your wife was sick. I remember. I covered Christmas Eve because your cook wanted to see his family. I remember that too. But now some strangers call, and I'm the problem. You're not the problem. That doesn't make a difference if I'm the one losing work. Annie, she ended the call. When she returned inside, Richard was speaking quietly with Thomas near the front window. Elizabeth sat on the couch with a blanket over her knees. Martha looked at Annie once and knew. He told you not to come in. For a few days. Without pay? Annie put her phone on the table. He says he believes me. Martha gave a small, bitter laugh. Belief that costs nothing is easy. A knock sounded at the front door. Thomas checked through the curtain before opening it. Mrs. Green stood on the porch with 2 women from New Promise Baptist Church. Behind them, Pastor Green carried a tray covered in foil. An older man from the barber shop held a folding chair under one arm. We brought breakfast, Mrs. Green announced. Martha looked toward the oatmeal. I already made breakfast. This is second breakfast. Within 20 minutes, the house filled with people. Someone brought fried chicken. Someone else brought cornbread, macaroni and cheese, sweet potato pie, canned peaches, and enough coffee for a church meeting. The older man from the barber shop placed his folding chair on the porch. What is that for? Annie asked. Watching the street. You don't have to do that. I know. 2 retired women from the neighborhood began writing down license plates of unfamiliar cars. Pastor Green called another pastor across town and asked him to arrange a second watch for the evening. Richard stood near the kitchen doorway, taking in the movement around him. No one asked him for money. No one asked for a photograph. People brought food, chairs, extension cords, phone chargers, and names of relatives who worked at the courthouse or the bank. They spoke to Martha first because this was her home. Mrs. Green handed Annie a plate. Eat. I'm not hungry. That may be true, but it is not useful. Annie took the plate. By mid-morning, reporters had gathered at the end of the street. Several neighbors formed a quiet line along the sidewalk, keeping them from approaching the house. One reporter shouted Annie's name. Another asked whether she had been paid. A third asked if Elizabeth Whitmore was inside. Annie moved toward the window, but Martha caught her wrist. Do not answer people who have already chosen the question they want. They're making me look like a criminal. They are making you look like whatever keeps people watching. Richard came closer. My communications team can fix some of this. Annie turned. Your communications team? They can release a statement. Explain that you acted in good faith. Demand that the stations remove your school photograph. And what will they call me? What do you mean? The brave young woman? The girl from a troubled neighborhood? The poor black teenager who saved a billionaire? Richard's expression tightened. They would protect you. No. They would package me. That is not what I'm offering. It's what your people know how to do. He lowered his voice. You are being attacked because of me. I'm being attacked because Victoria knows people are ready to believe the worst about me. I can still help. Annie looked toward the front window, where a reporter was trying to photograph the house through a gap between two neighbors. You can help by finding the truth, not by turning me into part of your public image. Richard seemed ready to object, then stopped. Elizabeth had been listening from the couch. She's right, she said. Richard looked at her. Elizabeth continued. Victoria wants this to become a contest between respectable people and a girl no one knows. If you make Annie your campaign, you let Victoria choose the argument. Annie sat beside Elizabeth. Maybe I shouldn't have gone to the wedding. Would you rather he had married her? No. Then do not confuse consequences with mistakes. Annie looked down at her untouched plate. Elizabeth reached for her hand. Her right hand still trembled, so she used her left. You walked into a room full of people with more money and influence than you may ever have, she said. You told them something they did not want to hear, and you stayed when they tried to remove you. Do not let them make you ashamed of that. Annie's eyes burned. They don't believe me. They do not have to believe you yet. Then what good is the truth? The truth is not weak because people refuse it at first. Martha stood at the sink, listening. Justice is not fair, she said. Poor people are expected to prove they are innocent. Rich people only have to appear trustworthy. Richard looked toward the floor. Outside, the reporters continued shouting. Thomas entered from the hallway carrying his laptop and a small notepad. I found the bank. Everyone turned toward him. Elizabeth sat upright. How? The estate insurance records listed valuables stored off-site under your maiden name. One entry refers to a rental fee paid annually to First Carolina Trust. Richard looked at the clock. Can we reach it today? The downtown branch closes at 4. Annie rose from the couch. Thomas shook his head. Victoria may be watching the house. She's already watching, Annie said. Waiting here won't change that. Richard looked through the curtain at the cameras, neighbors, and cars outside. We don't leave together, he said. 3 vehicles, 3 routes. Martha handed Annie the plate again before she could move. First you eat. Annie took a bite while Thomas mapped the streets. Outside, the story belonged to Victoria. By the end of the day, if they reached the bank before she did, that might begin to change. Thomas arranged the departure so no 2 vehicles left East Side at the same time. Pastor Green drove Elizabeth in the church's aging Ford sedan. With Martha beside her, Richard took Mrs. Green's Buick, because no reporter would expect him to leave in a car with a dented rear bumper and a church parking sticker. Thomas drove Annie in an unmarked SUV borrowed from a former colleague. They left through different streets and agreed to meet in the underground garage beneath First Carolina Trust. Annie watched the side mirror as Thomas turned twice without signaling. Are we being followed? Maybe. That means yes. It means I don't want to decide too early. A dark crossover stayed behind them through 2 intersections, then disappeared when Thomas entered a grocery store parking lot and exited through the loading lane. Still maybe? Annie asked. Less likely. Her phone vibrated. Another news alert carried her school photograph beside a picture of Victoria wiping tears outside the estate. Annie turned the screen face down. Thomas glanced at it. You should switch that off. Then I won't know what they're saying. You already know. She looked through the window. Knowing and seeing it are different. They are. One hurts more. Thomas took a side street toward downtown. Annie studied him. How long have you worked for Mr. Whitmore? 22 years. And you never knew his wife was alive? No. Did you ever question the accident? His hands tightened on the wheel. Not enough. It was not the answer she expected. Before she could ask more, he pointed toward the garage entrance. We're here. The others arrived within 6 minutes. Richard stepped out of Mrs. Green's Buick wearing a borrowed brown jacket over his white shirt. He looked uncomfortable without his usual driver, security detail, or tailored clothes. Martha noticed his expression. It will not hurt you to look ordinary for an afternoon. I don't know whether to be insulted. You'll survive. Elizabeth remained close to Pastor Green as they entered the elevator. She wore Martha's long coat and a scarf over her hair. The mirrored walls reflected 6 people who would never have appeared together under normal circumstances. At the lobby, Thomas stopped them. The box is under Elizabeth's maiden name. Only she and a bank officer should enter the vault. The rest of us wait here. Richard shook his head. She doesn't go anywhere alone. A man at the reception desk looked toward them. Elizabeth lowered her voice. Then, stop sounding like someone who owns the building. Richard glanced at the desk and stepped back. I'm going with her, Martha said. If the bank permits it. The branch manager approached before they reached the counter. He was a thin man in his late 60s with silver glasses and a nameplate reading Charles Bennett. Mrs. Harwood? He asked. Elizabeth froze at the sound of her maiden name. Yes. Mr. Bennett looked Hubble for several seconds. Recognition moved across his face, followed by disbelief. I was told you passed away. So was my husband. Bennett looked at Richard, then quickly returned his attention to Elizabeth. I apologize. That was not my place. It's all right. For access, I'll need identification and answers to the security questions attached to the account. Elizabeth handed him an expired driver's license Martha had kept with her belongings. Bennett examined it, then led her and Martha into a private office. Richard remained near the lobby windows. He checked the street every few seconds. Annie sat beside Pastor Green. You think Victoria knows we're here? She asked. She knows you are looking for something, he said. People who live by lies become skilled at noticing when others stop believing them. Across the lobby, Thomas spoke to a security officer and requested access to the garage cameras. Richard paced once, then stopped beside Annie. What if she can't answer the questions? She remembered the bank. She remembered a name in an insurance record. She remembered enough to write the letter. That is not the same as remembering the first address she ever lived at. Annie looked up at him. You keep treating her memory like a machine that should work because you need it to. He sat in the chair across from her. I lost her once. So did she. His expression hardened, then softened. Annie continued. You had a funeral. People brought food and told you they were sorry. She woke up in a stranger's house, couldn't remember her name, and had no idea who wanted her dead. Richard looked toward the office door. You're right. The words seemed difficult for him, but he did not take them back. 20 minutes later, Bennett returned. She answered the questions. Richard stood. Bennett lowered his voice. There is another issue. Someone attempted to access the box this morning. Thomas crossed the lobby. Who? A woman presented a key and a notarized authorization bearing Mrs. Harwood's signature. Victoria, Annie said. Bennett looked at her. The identification was in another name. Did she open it? No. The signature did not match our original card, and the account required personal verification. She left before we could contact security. Thomas asked for the lobby footage. Bennett agreed to preserve it for law enforcement but refused to release it without a subpoena. That may have saved Elizabeth's life, Richard said. Bennett removed his glasses. I only followed procedure. Martha emerged from the office. Sometimes procedure is what justice looks like when people bother to follow it. Elizabeth stood behind her holding a small brass key. Bennett led the two women through a reinforced door. Richard watched until they disappeared. The wait lasted 9 minutes. When Elizabeth returned, Martha carried a gray metal box against her chest. Bennett brought them into a private conference room and closed the blinds. Elizabeth inserted the key. Inside were several folders, a digital recorder, an envelope addressed to Richard, and a small flash drive with a blue light on one end. Richard stared at it. You found it, he said. I found enough to know I was in danger, Elizabeth replied. I just didn't live long enough that night to tell you. Thomas put on gloves and opened the first folder. It contained bank transfers from the Whitmore Foundation to 3 consulting firms. Each company used a different name, but shared the same Charleston mailing address. The second folder held a mechanic's preliminary report. The brake line on Elizabeth's car had been cut with a narrow blade. Richard read the page twice. This was never in the police file. Because Henry removed it, Elizabeth said. Thomas lifted a receipt showing a payment from Cole Legal Services to a county morgue employee 3 days after the crash. Annie opened another folder. Inside was the intake photograph of an unidentified woman whose body had been found after a warehouse fire. Her age, height, and hair color were close enough to Elizabeth's to support a false identification once the body was badly burned. Richard pushed his chair back. They buried her under Elizabeth's name. No one answered. Elizabeth picked up the digital recorder and pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room. You have no idea what you'll destroy if you take this to Richard. Then Elizabeth's younger voice answered, steady and clear. I'm not destroying anything, Victoria. I'm showing him what you built. A chair scraped against the floor in the recording. Victoria spoke again. If you do this, you will lose your marriage, your name, and every comfortable thing you think belongs to you. The recording stopped. Richard sat motionless, one hand over his mouth. Thomas examined the remaining pages. We have fraud, falsified identification, and proof the brakes were sabotaged, but one sheet is missing. Elizabeth looked at the folder. Which one? The mechanic named the person who delivered the car. That page has been removed. Martha checked the box again. Could Victoria have taken it? She never opened the box, Bennett said from the doorway. Thomas compared the page numbers. Then someone removed it before Elizabeth stored these records. Richard looked at the recorder. We know who planned it. We still need the person who carried it out, Thomas said. A security alarm sounded in the lobby. Bennett stepped into the hall, then returned at once. There's a vehicle blocking the garage exit. 2 men entered through the lower level. Thomas locked the conference room door. Richard gathered the folders while Annie slipped the flash drive into her coat pocket. Through the narrow glass panel beside the door, a man in a dark jacket crossed the lobby and looked directly toward the private offices. Thomas drew his weapon. They found us. Thomas moved away from the door and pointed toward the rear wall. Is there another exit? Bennett nodded. A staff corridor leads to the records room and the alley, but the alarm locks the exterior door. Can you override it? From the security desk. The men are between us and the desk, Annie said. Thomas looked through the narrow glass panel again. The first man was speaking to a bank guard. The second remained near the elevators, watching the private offices. They don't want a public scene, Thomas said. Not yet. Richard gathered the folders and placed them inside Bennett's leather document case. Then we walk out the front. Thomas turned. No, there are customers and cameras in the lobby. They cannot take Elizabeth without exposing themselves. They may not be here for Elizabeth. His eyes shifted to the case. Annie touched the flash drive in her pocket. The men might assume Richard carried everything. That gave her an advantage, but only if no one looked closely at her. Elizabeth stood beside the conference table. One hand braced against the chair. We cannot stay trapped in this room. Pastor Green moved closer to the door. What happens if we call the police? Thomas kept watching the lobby. The men leave before officers arrive. We lose the chance to identify them. Identifying them won't matter if someone gets hurt, Martha said. Thomas took out his phone and photographed both men through the glass. He sent the images to a former colleague with a short message, then called the security desk. Tell the guards there is a medical emergency in the conference room, he said to Bennett. Have them clear the corridor and bring a wheelchair. Bennett understood. He made the call. A minute later, a bank employee approached with a wheelchair. The first man watched her enter the private corridor. The second stepped away from the elevator. Thomas lowered his voice. Elizabeth sits in the chair. Martha and Pastor Green take her toward the main entrance. Richard follows with the case. Annie stays close to me. Richard objected. They'll follow the evidence. That is the point. They'll focus on you while Annie carries the drive. Richard looked at Annie's coat. You gave it to her? She took it before anyone had to tell her, Thomas said. Annie met Richard's eyes. They already think I'm just a girl being used by you. Let them keep thinking that. Elizabeth sat in the wheelchair. Martha tucked the blanket around her legs while Pastor Green placed both hands on the handles. When Bennett opened the door, Thomas stepped into the corridor first. My wife is having chest pain, he called loudly. Richard glanced at him but did not correct the lie. The bank guards moved toward them. Customers turned from the teller windows. The 2 men in dark jackets separated. One moved closer to Richard, the other watched the wheelchair. Thomas guided the group across the lobby. Sir, the first man said to Richard, Mr. Cole asked me to collect those documents. Richard did not slow. Then Mr. Cole can ask me himself. The man reached for the case. Thomas caught his wrist and turned him against a marble column. The second man rushed toward Elizabeth, but Pastor Green swung the wheelchair sideways. Martha stepped between them. You put your hands on her, Martha said, and this entire bank will watch an old woman knock you to the floor. The man hesitated long enough for both bank guards to surround him. Thomas pushed the first man's arm behind his back. A small handgun fell from beneath his jacket and struck the floor. Someone screamed. The lobby erupted. Customers crouched behind counters. Bennett shouted for the doors to be locked. One of the guards kicked the weapon away. The second man ran toward the garage stairs. Annie saw him reach inside his coat. He has something. Thomas released the first man and drew his own weapon. But the second man did not pull a gun. He threw a small device against the wall near the security desk. Smoke filled the lobby. The fire alarm began ringing. People rushed toward the exits. In the confusion, the first man tore free and followed his partner into the stairwell. Thomas started after them. Richard caught his arm. "Stay with Elizabeth. They'll get away. Let them. We have the files." Thomas looked toward the smoke, then holstered his weapon. Bennett led everyone through a side corridor while the bank guards evacuated the lobby. The exterior door released automatically with the fire alarm, opening into a narrow alley. Pastor Green pushed Elizabeth into the fresh air. Martha followed, coughing. Annie came out behind Richard, one hand still pressed over the flash drive. Sirens approached from two directions. Thomas checked the street. "We need to move before local police start asking where the documents came from." Richard stared at him. "A gun was pulled inside a bank. We are not leaving. The authorization used at the county archive came from Whitmore Legal. These men claimed Henry sent them. Until we know who is compromised, every statement creates another leak." Richard looked toward Elizabeth. Her face had lost color, though she insisted she could stand. Bennett stepped into the alley. "The police will need witnesses. I can give them the footage and identify the men." Thomas handed him a card bearing a number that did not connect to Whitmore Holdings. "Call this line if anyone asks for the vault records without a warrant." Bennett accepted it. "Where are you taking Mrs. Harwood?" "Somewhere safe. There may be no such place left," Bennett said. No one disagreed. They divided into the same 3 vehicles, but changed drivers and routes. Annie rode with Richard this time. She kept the flash drive beneath her palm throughout the trip. Richard watched the streets through the rear window. "You were right to take it," he said. "I didn't know whether Thomas would trust me with it." "He did." "Do you?" Richard looked at her. "I stopped my wedding because you brought me a note. I followed you into a neighborhood where no one knew whether I was part of the danger. Now you are carrying the only copy of evidence that could destroy my company. I think we passed trust a few miles ago." Annie almost smiled, but Thomas's vehicle slowed ahead of them. They followed him to New Promise Baptist Church. Pastor Green unlocked a side entrance, and the group gathered in the fellowship hall while sirens continued toward downtown. Thomas connected his laptop to the church network. A message from his former colleague was waiting. Both men had worked for Cole Risk Management. One was a former county deputy. The other had spent 6 years as a private investigator for Henry Cole. Richard read the names on the screen. "Call Henry," he said. Thomas looked at him. "That warns him. He already knows we have the box." Elizabeth sat at one of the folding tables. "Then ask him something only an innocent man would answer without preparing." Richard used Martha's flip phone and dialed Henry's private number from memory. Henry answered after 4 rings. "Hello? Where are the accident files?" Richard asked. Silence followed. Then Henry said, "Richard, whose number is this?" "That was not my question. I heard about what happened at the bank. Victoria's telling people you've been manipulated. 2 men from your brother's company tried to take documents from me." Another pause. "I did not send anyone. They said you did. Then they were lying." Richard looked at Elizabeth. "Did you intercept letters from my wife?" Henry's breathing became audible. "Richard, Elizabeth is dead." She leaned toward the phone. "No, Henry," Elizabeth said. "I'm not." The line went silent. Richard's face hardened. "You have one chance to tell me the truth." Henry finally spoke, but his voice had changed. "If she is alive, none of you understand how much danger you are in." The call ended. Thomas tried the number again. It went directly to voicemail. Richard set down the phone. He knew. Elizabeth looked at the folders spread across the church table. "Knowing is not the same as planning." "No," Thomas said, "but silence can protect a plan just as well as money." His laptop chimed. A second message had arrived from his former colleague. Attached was an old vehicle maintenance log recovered from a private database. Thomas opened it and went still. Richard noticed. "What is it?" Thomas turned the screen toward them. The log showed that Elizabeth's car had been brought to the Whitmore estate garage 6 hours before the crash. The inspection had been authorized by the head of executive security. At the bottom of the page was Thomas Reed's electronic signature. No one spoke. Annie looked from the screen to the man standing beside it. Thomas did not deny what they could all see. "I inspected that car," he said. Richard stared at Thomas's electronic signature on the screen. "You inspected Elizabeth's car 6 hours before the crash?" "Yes." "And you never told me?" Thomas looked at Elizabeth. The brake pedal felt wrong. "I found pressure loss in the rear line, but there was no visible leak. I ordered the car held for a full inspection." Elizabeth's face tightened. "Then why was I allowed to drive it?" "I left the garage to deal with a security issue at the hotel. When I returned, the work order had been closed and the car was gone." "Who closed it?" Annie asked. "Henry's office sent an authorization saying Mrs. Whitmore needed the vehicle immediately." Richard stepped closer. "You knew the car might be unsafe. I called Henry. He said a mechanic had checked it and found nothing." "You believed him?" "No. That's why I went looking for the mechanic." Thomas reached into his jacket and removed an old flash drive. "I found Calvin Ross 2 days after the funeral. He worked temporary shifts in the estate garage. He admitted Henry paid him to release the car, but he denied cutting the brake line." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Elizabeth asked. Thomas's grip tightened around the drive. "Henry showed me records that made it look as though my son had stolen money from a security account. He said the evidence would go to federal investigators if I spoke." Richard's voice hardened. "So you protected your son?" "I told myself I was protecting him." "And what were you protecting Elizabeth from?" Thomas did not answer. Annie stood beside the folding table, watching a man who had spent decades guarding powerful people fail to defend the truth when it mattered. "You kept that drive for 5 years, she said. "I copied a garage video before Henry erased the system. Then you had evidence." "I had enough to raise questions, not enough to prove murder. Evidence hidden in your pocket isn't justice." Thomas met her eyes. "I know. No, you know it now because the people you failed are standing in front of you." Richard placed both hands on the table. "Show us the video." Thomas inserted the drive into the laptop. A grainy image appeared from a camera overlooking the estate garage. The timestamp showed the afternoon of the crash. Calvin Ross stood beside Elizabeth's car with the hood raised. Henry entered carrying a document envelope. The two men spoke beyond the camera's microphone range. Henry handed over the envelope and pointed toward the rear of the vehicle. Calvin glanced at the camera. The footage ended. "That's all?" Richard asked. The remaining file was corrupted. Elizabeth stared at Henry's frozen image. He was there. "Yes," Thomas said. Richard turned on him. "You attended her funeral. You stood beside me while I buried someone else. Every day after that, you knew the official story might be false. I suspected the accident had been arranged. I did not know she survived. You knew enough." "I did." Richard struck the folding table with his palm. Coffee spilled from a paper cup. Pastor Green entered from the hallway, took in the scene, and quietly closed the door behind him. Thomas removed his badge and placed it beside the laptop. "You should dismiss me." Richard looked at the badge but did not touch it. "That would be easier for you." "I'm not asking for easy." "No, you're asking me to decide what kind of man you are before I've decided what kind of man I was." Elizabeth reached for Richard's wrist. The contact stopped him from pacing. Thomas said, "I can send the video and the bank records to someone outside Charleston, Special Agent Helen Brooks. She investigated corporate fraud for the FBI before transferring to the field office in Columbia. Henry tried to have her removed from a Whitmore inquiry 7 years ago. Can you trust her?" Annie asked. "She dislikes me. That helps." Pastor Green folded his arms. "Trust built on dislike. That may be the most honest arrangement in this room." Thomas encrypted the files and sent them through a secure portal. He included the names of the two men from the bank, the archive access record, and the recording from the safe deposit box. A confirmation appeared. "Now it exists somewhere Victoria cannot reach," he said. A sound came from the rear of the church. Glass breaking. Thomas shut the laptop and drew his weapon. Pastor Green switched off the fellowship hall lights. Another crash followed, closer this time. "The side entrance," Annie whispered. Richard moved in front of Elizabeth. Thomas pointed toward the kitchen. "There's an exit through the pantry?" Pastor Green nodded. "Leads to the alley." They moved through the dark fellowship hall. Folding chairs cast long shapes across the floor. Annie stayed beside Martha, whose breathing remained controlled despite the hand gripping Annie's arm. A flashlight beam swept across the doorway behind them. "Someone's inside," a man said. Thomas waited near the kitchen entrance until everyone passed, then followed. Pastor Green unlocked the pantry door. The alley beyond was empty. "Go to Martha's house," Thomas said. "Stay off the main street." Richard shook his head. "You're coming. I need to see who entered. You already know who sent them. I need proof." Annie looked back toward the fellowship hall. "They may be looking for the bank files. They'll find an empty laptop bag. And then they'll search the neighborhood." Thomas considered that. A second flashlight appeared through the kitchen window. They left through the alley and crossed 2 backyards. Pastor Green knew which gates stuck and which dogs would bark. At the 3rd house, an older man watering his tomatoes saw the group and opened his side gate without asking questions. By the time they reached Martha's street, neighbors were already outside. Mrs. Green stood on her porch in a robe, speaking into her phone. The retired barber held a flashlight and a wooden baseball bat. "What happened?" Martha asked. "Your back window," Mrs. Green said. "Someone broke in 5 minutes ago." Thomas signaled for everyone to remain outside while he checked the house. Richard ignored him and followed. The kitchen had been overturned. Drawers lay open. Dishes covered the floor, and the couch cushions had been cut apart. Whoever entered had searched quickly and without concern for noise. Annie ran to the freezer. The bags of vegetables had been thrown onto the floor. Frozen casseroles and wrapped meat covered the tiles. She reached into the back and pulled out the grocery bag containing the original flash drive from the bank. "It's still here." Thomas inspected the broken window. They didn't know where to look. Martha bent and picked up a piece of blue and white porcelain. It belonged to a serving plate Elizabeth had given her when Annie was young. Annie touched her shoulder. "Grandma, leave it. You'll cut yourself." Martha gathered the larger pieces into her apron. "It was Elizabeth's. It's broken. That does not mean it has no value." Richard looked around the damaged kitchen. "I'll replace everything." Martha straightened. "That is the first answer money teaches a man." He stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. "What do you need?" "For the people who did this, to understand that this house is not empty just because poor people live in it." Outside, more neighbors arrived. Some brought coffee. Others carried folding chairs and blankets. 2 retired veterans took positions at opposite ends of the block. Women from the church began sweeping glass from the porch while Mrs. Green organized overnight watches. Richard stood in the doorway and watched a community protect one another without contracts, salaries, or instructions from him. "I've driven past East Side for 30 years, he said to Annie. "My company maps call it a redevelopment zone." Annie looked at Mrs. Green pouring coffee for the men on watch. "People call a place broken when they want to forget who lives there." Richard nodded, ashamed that the sentence felt new to him. Thomas's phone vibrated. He read the message twice. "Agent Brooks received the files. She wants to meet tomorrow morning." "Where?" Richard asked. "Not here. She says we should assume every Whitmore property is compromised." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Everyone turned. Thomas raised his weapon and moved toward the sound. He checked the bedroom, bathroom, and closet before returning. "Clear." Martha looked past him toward the small room where Elizabeth had slept for 5 years. The bed was empty. Her blanket lay on the floor. On the pillow rested a folded sheet of paper. Richard opened it with shaking hands. "Bring the evidence to the old Cooper River shipyard tomorrow night. Come alone, or Elizabeth dies." Annie took the note and studied the handwriting. "This isn't Victoria's." Richard looked at her. "How can you know?" She pointed to the narrow, backward-leaning letters. "I saw this writing on the legal documents from the bank." Thomas understood first. "Henry Cole," he said. Richard read the note again, as if the words might change if he stared long enough. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Why give us that much time?" "Because Henry needs something," Thomas replied. "If he only wanted Elizabeth dead, he would not have left instructions." Martha stood beside the empty bed, holding the broken pieces of the porcelain plate in her apron. "He wants the evidence. He wants money too," Annie said. "A man who helped hide a murder for 5 years does not suddenly take a hostage just to clean up someone else's mess." Richard folded the note. "Then I give him both." "No," Thomas said. Richard turned on him. "He has my wife. And if you arrive alone with everything he asks for, he will have your wife, the evidence, and the only person wealthy enough to pay him. I'm not debating this. You hired me to keep you alive. I hired you to protect my family. You already failed once. Thomas accepted the blow without looking away. That is why I will not fail the same way again. Outside, neighbors continued sweeping glass and carrying damaged furniture onto the porch. Their voices entered through the broken kitchen window, a reminder that the danger had spread beyond the Whitmore family. Annie examined the note beneath the kitchen light. Henry's letters leaned backward, the same as the signatures on the legal forms from the safe deposit box. At the bottom, he had written one more instruction in smaller print. No police, no federal agents. Bring the original drive and every paper from box 317. He knows the box number, she said. Thomas looked over her shoulder. Henry prepared some of the bank documents. He may have known Elizabeth rented it before the accident. Then why didn't he empty it years ago? He didn't have access without Elizabeth's authorization. Annie shook her head. Victoria tried this morning with a forged signature. Maybe Henry sent her there. Or she learned about the box from him, Richard said. Martha sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time that evening, she looked her age. Elizabeth was sleeping when they took her. She would have fought. Thomas checked the windowsill and the floor. There are no signs of a struggle. That does not mean she went willingly, Annie replied. Richard studied the room. Elizabeth's shoes remained beside the bed. Her coat was gone, but her purse still hung from the chair. He threatened someone, Richard said. Martha or Annie. Annie remembered the broken window at the church, the men moving through the dark fellowship hall, and the few minutes when the house had been left under the watch of neighbors who did not know Elizabeth's face. Henry could have told her he had Grandma. Martha nodded. She would have gone with him to protect me. Thomas stepped into the hallway and called Mrs. Green. He asked whether anyone had seen a vehicle near the back alley. After a short conversation, he returned. A white utility van was parked 2 streets over. No company markings. Mrs. Green saw it leave while we were at the church. Traffic cameras? Richard asked. I can check city feeds, but Henry knows our security methods. He may have changed vehicles. Richard took Martha's flip phone from his pocket. I'm calling him. He will call us, Thomas said. I am done waiting for men like Henry to decide when I'm allowed to know what is happening. Before Thomas could stop him, Richard dialed Henry's private number. The call went straight to voicemail. Richard tried again. This time someone answered. No one spoke at first. Then Elizabeth's voice came through, thin but steady. Richard? He gripped the phone with both hands. Are you hurt? I'm all right. Where are you? A man took the phone. Do not ask questions. You know I won't answer, Henry said. Richard's face hardened. If you touch her, I have spent 5 years cleaning up problems for your family. Do not speak to me as if I am some stranger who wandered into your home. You took my wife from her bed. Because you stopped listening. I never heard the truth from you. Henry laughed once. You never wanted the truth. You wanted matters handled before they reached your desk. The accusation struck close enough that Richard did not respond. Henry continued. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, the Cooper River shipyard. Bring the box documents and the drive. How much money? A pause followed. $50 million transferred to an account I will provide. Martha closed her eyes. Richard said, I want proof Elizabeth is alive when I arrive. You just heard her. I want to see her before I transfer anything. You are in no position to negotiate. I am the only person who can move that amount without triggering questions. That gives me a position. Thomas watched Richard carefully. The boardroom voice had returned, but now it carried fear beneath the control. Henry considered the demand. You will see her from a distance. You come alone. I'll need someone to handle the transfer. Bring a laptop. What happens after payment? I leave. Elizabeth goes home. Victoria takes the fall she earned. Annie looked at Thomas. Henry had confirmed what they suspected. He was no longer protecting Victoria. He was trying to escape her. Richard asked, Does Victoria know you have Elizabeth? Henry did not answer. That silence told them enough. If she finds you first, Richard said, she will kill both of you. You should worry about arriving on time. The call ended. Thomas took the phone and checked the number. Burner. No usable location. Richard walked back into the kitchen. I'll arrange the transfer. You're not paying him, Annie said. He faced her. He has Elizabeth. And after you pay, he still has Elizabeth. I heard what he said. So did I. He helped fake her death. Why would his words suddenly mean something? Richard's voice rose. What would you have me do? The room fell quiet. Annie had seen powerful men grow angry when they could not buy a solution. This anger was different. Richard was terrified, and fear had narrowed his world until only one action remained visible. We make him believe you are doing exactly what he asked, she said. Then we use what he doesn't know. What doesn't he know? That the federal agents already have copies. Thomas nodded. Agent Brooks has the financial files, the garage video, and the recording. Henry's leverage is weaker than he thinks. But he still has Elizabeth, Richard said. Yes, Annie replied. So the plan has to protect her before it protects the evidence. Thomas opened his laptop and pulled up a satellite map of the old shipyard. The property covered several acres beside the river, with rusted warehouses, loading cranes, and abandoned offices. There are 3 vehicle entrances, he said. The south gate faces the road. The west service entrance connects to an old rail line. The riverside is open. Richard pointed to the largest building. Henry will choose that one. It gives him height and sight lines. You've been there? Whitmore Holdings considered buying it 12 years ago. Annie leaned over the map. Does Victoria know that? She attended the site review. Thomas looked at Richard. Then she will know where Henry took Elizabeth once she realizes he has turned against her. Richard's eyes narrowed. She may already know. The old flip phone rang again. Thomas answered and activated the speaker. Victoria's voice filled the damaged kitchen. Richard, Henry has lost control. Whatever he told you, do not go to the shipyard. Where are you? Richard asked. That does not matter. Do you know he has Elizabeth? I know he intends to sell you a story and disappear with your money. Annie watched Richard's face. Ask how she knows the location, she whispered. Richard did. I never told you where he wanted to meet. Victoria went silent. Then she said, Richard, listen to me. Henry is dangerous. So are you. The call ended. Thomas stared at the phone. She's going to the shipyard. To rescue Elizabeth? Martha asked. No, Annie said. To make sure no one leaves alive. Richard looked at the satellite image, then at the note Henry had left. I'm going in through the south gate as ordered. Thomas began to object. But Richard raised a hand. You and Agent Brooks, stay out of sight. Annie stays here. No, Annie said. This is not open for discussion. Henry ignored me at the bank. Victoria thinks no one will believe me. Both of them see me as the least important person in this story. That is exactly why you should be nowhere near them. It is why I can get closer than you can. Martha rose and went to the bedroom dresser. She returned with an old white handkerchief embroidered with a blue butterfly. She placed it in Annie's hand. Richard stared at her. You are allowing this? No, Martha said. I am recognizing that she made her choice before either of us spoke. She closed Annie's fingers around the cloth. Courage does not mean you are not afraid. It means you know what is worth fearing, and still step forward. Thomas studied the map once more. We meet Agent Brooks at dawn. No local police until Elizabeth is visible. Richard enters first. Annie and I use the west service route. Richard looked at Annie, understanding he had lost the argument. If anything changes, you leave. I'll leave when Elizabeth does. Outside, the neighbors settled into folding chairs for the night. Inside, the 4 of them planned around a kitchen table covered with broken glass, bank records, and a map of the shipyard. Across Charleston, Henry waited with a hostage and an exit plan. Victoria was already on her way to destroy both. Richard entered the shipyard through the south gate at 8:57. The chain-link fence had been cut years earlier, and rusted signs still warned against trespassing. Beyond them stood the remains of the Cooper River shipyard. Loading cranes frozen above the water, warehouses with broken windows, and stretches of concrete split by weeds. Richard drove his own car, as Henry had ordered. A laptop sat on the passenger seat. The bank transfer screen displayed $50 million waiting for final authorization. He stopped outside the largest warehouse and left the headlights on. No one came to meet him. He took Martha's flip phone from his pocket and called the number Henry had used. It rang once. Leave the car, Henry said. Bring the laptop and the document case. I want to see Elizabeth. You will. Now. A light appeared in a second-floor office above the warehouse floor. Elizabeth stood behind a wall of dirty glass. Her hands were bound in front of her. Henry held her by one arm. Richard's breath caught, but he kept his voice level. Let her come down. Transfer the money first. I cannot authorize it without a secure connection. There is a router in the office. And you expect me to trust your network? Henry gave a short laugh. You trusted my legal advice for 23 years. The line went dead. Richard picked up the laptop and leather case. Before closing the car door, he looked once toward the west side of the property. He could not see Thomas or Annie. That was the plan. Annie lay beneath an abandoned rail platform 200 yards away, listening through an earpiece Thomas had given her. The concrete beneath her coat was cold. Above them, wind moved through dry grass and loose sheet metal. Thomas studied the warehouse through binoculars. One man at the north door, he whispered. Another near the river entrance. Henry said Richard should come alone. Henry also said he would release Elizabeth. Annie pressed a hand over the small recorder in her pocket. Thomas had given her a second phone set to transmit audio directly to Agent Brooks, who waited with a federal team beyond the western fence. They could not move until Elizabeth was clear of Henry's gun. Richard crossed the warehouse floor. Inside, old machinery formed dark shapes beneath hanging chains. Water dripped from the roof. His footsteps echoed across the building. A man searched him near the stairs, taking his wallet and phone. He missed the small transmitter sewn into Richard's jacket collar. Up, the man said. Richard climbed the metal staircase. Henry waited in the office with Elizabeth. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, as if he had left work early instead of kidnapping a woman. A handgun rested in his right hand. Elizabeth looked tired but alert. Richard set the laptop and case on a desk. Are you hurt? I'm all right, she said. Henry pulled her back before Richard could move closer. Open the account. Richard raised the laptop lid. You release her when the funds clear. She leaves after I confirm the money. No, she stands beside me before I approve anything. Henry's mouth tightened. This is not one of your negotiations. That is exactly what it is. You need my authorization. I need my wife. Elizabeth looked at Richard and gave the smallest shake of her head. Henry noticed. What was that? Nothing, she said. He tightened his grip on her arm. Richard's controls slipped. Take your hand off her. Henry raised the gun. Sit down. Richard sat. Below the office, Annie and Thomas reached the side of the warehouse. One of Henry's men had left the river entrance to check a noise near the gate. Thomas used the opening to slip inside. Annie followed him between stacks of rotting pallets. Through the office windows above, she saw Elizabeth, Richard, and Henry. Thomas pointed toward a narrow service staircase at the rear. You stay here, he whispered. That wasn't the plan. The man at the north door has a clear line to the stairs. Then I distract him. No. Annie looked at the broken control panel beside them. A red emergency switch remained beneath a cracked plastic cover. What does that do? Probably an old alarm. Probably? Before Thomas could stop her, Annie struck the switch. A horn sounded deep inside the warehouse. The noise rolled through the building. The guard at the north door turned toward the control panel. Thomas moved behind him, caught his arm, and forced him to the ground before he could draw his weapon. Upstairs, Henry spun toward the window. What did you do? He asked Richard. Nothing. Henry dragged Elizabeth toward the desk and pointed the gun at Richard. Annie ran to the service stairs. By the time she reached the office level, the horn had stopped. She crouched behind a row of filing cabinets outside the glass wall. Henry entered an account number on the laptop. Transfer the money. Richard looked at Elizabeth. Her eyes moved toward the office door. Henry followed her gaze and raised the gun. Who was out there? No one answered. He pulled Elizabeth in front of him and backed toward the wall. Annie pressed the transmit button on her phone, then slid it beneath the filing cabinet where it would continue recording even if she was searched. She stood and stepped into view. Henry stared at her. You sound disappointed. What are you doing here? Mr. Whitmore needed help carrying the paperwork. Richard's face gave nothing away. Henry pointed the gun at her. Get inside. Annie entered slowly, leaving the door open behind her. Close it. She did. Henry looked from Annie to Richard. You brought a teenager to a hostage exchange? Richard replied. She refused to stay behind. That does sound like her. Annie kept her attention on Elizabeth. The older woman's right hand trembled, but her breathing remained steady. Henry pushed the leather case toward Annie with his foot. "Open it." She knelt and lifted the clasps. Inside were copies of the bank records and several blank folders placed beneath them. Henry noticed the difference in thickness. "Where are the originals?" "Somewhere safe," Richard said. Henry struck the desk with the gun. "I told you to bring everything. You told me to bring evidence." "I did. These are copies. They prove the same crimes. They cannot be destroyed if the originals still exist." Richard leaned back. "That is the point." Henry's face changed. For years, he had controlled what Richard saw, signed, and believed. Now the old methods no longer worked. "You think sending copies to federal agents protects you?" he asked. Richard said nothing. Henry looked at Annie. "Did you send them?" She shrugged. "You always assume I'm carrying something." His eyes narrowed. Annie continued. "That was your mistake at the bank. You watched the billionaire and ignored the girl." Henry stepped closer. "Where's the drive?" "I don't have it." He grabbed the front of her coat and searched the pockets. He found Martha's handkerchief, a bus pass, and a few folded bills. Nothing else. Annie held his gaze. "Disappointed again?" Henry released her. Richard used the moment to move closer to Elizabeth. Henry saw him and swung the gun back. "Sit down." Richard stopped. Annie looked toward the dark window behind Henry. Outside, a pair of headlights crossed the shipyard and went out. Someone else had arrived. Henry heard the vehicle and turned toward the glass. Richard followed his gaze. "You were expecting company?" "No." Below them, a car door slammed. A woman's voice echoed across the warehouse floor. "Henry." Elizabeth closed her eyes. Victoria had found them. Henry stepped back from the window. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. Richard rose slowly. "You said she didn't know where you were." "She wasn't supposed to." Victoria's heels struck the metal stairs, each step drawing closer. Annie glanced at the phone hidden outside the office. It was still transmitting. Henry aimed the gun at the door. Victoria appeared behind the glass, wearing a dark coat over the white silk slip from her wedding dress. She looked at Elizabeth, then at Richard, and finally at the weapon in Henry's hand. "You always were careless," she said. Victoria entered the office and closed the door behind her. Her gaze settled on Elizabeth. For a second, the confidence left her face. 5 years of planning had depended on the woman before her remaining dead. "You should have stayed hidden," Victoria said. Elizabeth stood straighter despite Henry's hand on her arm. "You should have made sure I was." Henry shifted the gun toward Victoria. "You were told not to come. You stopped following instructions when you took her. I needed leverage. You needed discipline." Richard moved between Annie and the desk. "Let Elizabeth go." Victoria looked at him as if he had interrupted a private conversation. "You still think you are in charge. This ends tonight. It ended 5 years ago. You simply refused to accept the version I gave you." Henry's gun remained fixed on her. "We had an agreement. We had an arrangement. You were paid to manage the legal details, not kidnap people, and demand $50 million. You were going to leave me with the blame." Victoria removed her gloves one finger at a time. "You signed the records. You paid the morgue employee. You hired Calvin Ross. You ordered it." Richard's expression tightened. "Ordered what?" Neither answered. Annie glanced toward the filing cabinet outside the office. The hidden phone was still transmitting. A faint green light reflected from beneath the metal frame. Victoria noticed Annie looking toward the door. "What did you bring?" she asked. "Nothing. You ran into my wedding carrying one message. I doubt you came here empty-handed." Annie kept her voice even. "You searched me at the bank through Henry's men. They found nothing then, too." Victoria looked at Henry. "Your men failed at the bank?" "They were interrupted. By an 18-year-old girl. By security." Annie saw the insult land. Victoria had spent years believing people beneath her could not threaten her. Henry's failure challenged more than her plan. It challenged the way she understood power. Richard stepped closer to Elizabeth. "Why did you do it?" Victoria turned toward him. "Do what?" "Stop pretending." He pointed to Elizabeth's scar. "You arranged the crash. You replaced her body. You let me bury a stranger." Victoria studied him. "Would hearing me deny it help?" "I want the truth." "You have never wanted the truth. You wanted someone to make difficult things disappear." Henry gave a nervous laugh. "She's right about that." Richard ignored him. Victoria continued. Elizabeth found the transfers. She had no idea how many people depended on those investments. They were foundation funds, Elizabeth said. Money meant for clinics, housing, and scholarships. They were funds sitting unused while you played philanthropist. You stole them. I moved them. To companies you controlled. To opportunities your husband was too cautious to see. Richard looked at her. You built those companies? Victoria's expression shifted from defense to pride. I built the structure. Henry created the contracts. The returns would have covered everything before anyone noticed. Elizabeth said, the returns failed. For a few months. And you kept taking more. Victoria's jaw tightened. You were going to destroy all of it because numbers on a page offended your sense of virtue. I was going to tell my husband. That was the danger. Richard's face went still. Victoria met his eyes. You would have believed her. You always believed her. Henry lowered the gun slightly. Victoria, stop talking. She turned on him. Why? Federal agents already have copies. Don't they? No one answered. Her attention moved to Richard's jacket. You wore a transmitter. Richard said nothing. Victoria laughed without humor. Thomas Reed finally found his courage. Henry crossed the office and seized Richard by the collar. He searched the jacket, found the transmitter sewn near the lapel, and crushed it beneath his shoe. Annie did not look toward the hidden phone. Henry aimed the gun at Richard. Who is listening? Maybe no one now. You think this is clever? No. I think it is overdue. Victoria walked to the desk and examined the bank documents. Copies? Yes, Richard said. Where are the originals? Beyond your reach. Her hand stopped on the folder. For the first time, Annie saw Victoria understand that destroying the people in the room would not destroy the case. Henry saw it too. You lied to me, he said. You said the evidence was all here. I said Richard would bring what he had. You knew federal agents were involved. I suspected. And you still came? Victoria looked at him. I came because you had become a problem. Henry raised the gun toward her chest. Richard moved closer to Elizabeth, but Victoria noticed. Stay where you are. She reached inside her coat. Henry reacted first, grabbing her wrist. A small pistol slipped from her hand and struck the floor. Annie moved toward Elizabeth. Henry swung the gun toward her. Back. Victoria drove her elbow into Henry's ribs. He stumbled against the desk, and Richard pulled Elizabeth away. Annie caught Elizabeth's bound hands and worked at the plastic tie with the edge of a broken metal clip. Henry regained his footing and pointed the gun at Richard. Transfer the money now. Victoria stood behind him, breathing hard. You are not leaving this building. Neither are you unless I get paid. You think money will protect you? It protected you for 5 years. Victoria's face hardened. I protected myself. You were useful. Henry looked at her. I changed the morgue records. You followed instructions. I found the unidentified body. You were paid. I hired Ross and failed to ensure Elizabeth died. Elizabeth's wrists came free. Annie pressed the metal clip into her palm and whispered, When I move, go through the side door. Elizabeth shook her head. Not without Richard. Across the room, Henry asked, Who cut the brake line? Victoria said nothing. He stepped closer. You told me Ross handled it. He did. Ross swore he only released the car. Victoria's eyes moved toward the window. Richard saw it. You cut the line yourself. Her silence confirmed it. Elizabeth stared at her. You came to the garage after our meeting. I came to make sure the car was ready. You opened the rear service panel. Victoria's voice sharpened. You were going to take everything from me. It was never yours. Richard looked at the woman he had nearly married. You tried to kill her because she found stolen money. No, I tried to stop her because she would have ruined the only life I had built. You built it inside mine. Victoria stepped toward him. And who gave me the space? You did. After the accident, you handed me your schedule, your home, your grief. I chose who spoke to you. I chose what letters reached your desk. I sat beside you while you mourned, and you never once asked why I was always there. Richard absorbed the words without defending himself. Henry's grip on the gun loosened as he listened. Annie knew this was the moment. People like Victoria spoke most freely when they believed confession was another form of victory. So the wedding was the last step, Annie said. Victoria looked at her. The wedding was security, access to his property, his voting shares, his trusts, his name. You never loved him. Victoria glanced at Richard. Love is what people call dependence, when they want it to sound noble. Richard's face showed no shock now, only recognition. From beneath the filing cabinet outside, the phone continued sending every word. Henry noticed Annie's attention drift for half a second. He turned toward the door. What is out there? Annie stepped between him and the exit. Move. She did not. Henry grabbed her coat and shoved her aside. As he reached the doorway, Thomas appeared at the end of the walkway below. Henry raised the gun. Richard lunged. The shot tore through the office. Richard fell against the desk. One hand clamped over his shoulder. Elizabeth screamed his name. Victoria snatched her pistol from the floor. Annie grabbed Elizabeth and pulled her through the side door as another shot shattered the glass behind them. They ran onto the metal walkway above the warehouse floor. Victoria followed, gun in hand. You should have stayed out of this, she shouted. Annie kept moving. Behind them, Richard lay bleeding. Henry fought to escape, and Thomas climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Ahead, the walkway ended at the river loading platform. There was nowhere left to run. Annie reached the loading platform with Elizabeth beside her. The river moved below them, black beneath the weak lights of the shipyard. Rusted rails ran to the edge, where cargo had once been lowered onto barges. The nearest stairs were behind Victoria. Give me the phone, Victoria said. Annie kept one hand around Elizabeth's arm. I don't have it. You came here to record me. You think everyone carries proof because you spent 5 years destroying it. Victoria aimed the gun at Annie's chest. Where's the phone? Elizabeth stepped forward. Leave her alone. Victoria shifted the weapon toward her. You should be dead. You already said that. I gave you 5 years you were never meant to have. Elizabeth's right hand trembled, but her voice did not. You took 5 years from all of us. Behind Victoria, metal rang as Thomas climbed onto the walkway. Henry shouted from inside the office, followed by the sound of furniture striking the floor. Victoria glanced back. Annie pulled Elizabeth toward a stack of steel drums beside the loading crane. A bullet struck the railing, throwing sparks into the air. Stop! Victoria shouted. They crouched behind the drums. Thomas appeared at the far end of the walkway with his weapon raised. Victoria, put the gun down. She seized Elizabeth by the back of her coat and dragged her upright before Thomas could move closer. The barrel pressed against Elizabeth's side. Drop yours, Victoria said. Thomas held his position. Federal agents are outside. There is nowhere to go. You said that to Henry too? He is under control. A crash came from the office. Henry stumbled through the broken doorway, one hand pressed against his mouth. Richard followed, pale from blood loss, his injured arm hanging close to his body. Henry reached the railing. Victoria, give me the gun. She laughed. You lost yours? Richard knocked it over the edge. Richard leaned against the doorway. Blood had spread across his shirt, but his eyes remained on Elizabeth. Let her go. Victoria tightened her grip. You chose her again. There was never a choice. You were standing beside me yesterday. I was standing beside a lie. Her face changed. The anger remained, but something beneath it cracked. For 5 years, I handled everything. Your company, your schedule, your grief. I sat with you when you couldn't sleep. I listened while you talked about her as if she had been some perfect woman. Elizabeth looked at Richard. He answered without taking his eyes from Victoria. You listened because you needed to know what I remembered. I stayed because no one else could reach you. You made sure no one else could. Victoria's voice rose. I gave you a life after she was gone. You made her gone. The words silenced her. Annie could see the hidden phone through the broken office door. It remained beneath the filing cabinet, its small light still on. Victoria had confessed to the fraud, the crash, the false identification, and the wedding plan. The recording had survived, but only if Agent Brooks was still receiving it. Thomas seemed to understand where Annie was looking. He shifted one step to the right, drawing Victoria's attention away from the office. Put the gun down, he said. You can still walk out alive. Victoria looked toward the river. And spend the rest of my life in prison? That decision belongs to a court. Courts believe people like me. Annie stood slowly. Victoria swung the gun toward her. Stay down. Annie raised her empty hands. You believed that at the wedding too. Do not test me. You thought no one would listen because I came from East Side. You thought my clothes, my skin, and my address would matter more than what I carried. They did matter. Look at what the news said about you. For one day, Victoria's jaw tightened. Annie continued. Then you started talking. Enough. You told us about the money. You admitted you controlled Richard's mail. You said the wedding would give you his trusts and shares. Victoria looked toward the office. Annie saw the realization arrive. The phone isn't on me, she said. Victoria shoved Elizabeth aside and ran toward the office. Thomas moved to intercept her. But Henry grabbed his arm. They struck the railing together. Thomas's weapon slid across the metal floor. Victoria reached the broken doorway. Annie got there first. She kicked the office door shut and pulled the bent handle downward. The damaged frame caught for 1 second, long enough to block Victoria's path. Victoria turned and struck Annie across the face with the gun. Annie fell against the railing. Pain spread through her jaw. Elizabeth moved between them. Stop. Victoria stared at her. You still think he loves you after all this? Elizabeth looked past her toward Richard. He did not forget me, she said. You only trapped him inside a lie. Victoria raised the gun. Richard crossed the walkway despite Thomas shouting for him to stay back. Victoria. She looked at him. If there was ever anything real in what you felt for me, end this now. For a moment, her hand lowered. Then sirens sounded beyond the shipyard fence. Red and blue light moved across the broken windows. Victoria's expression hardened. You brought them. Richard shook his head. The truth did. She seized Annie by the shoulder and pulled her toward the edge of the loading platform. Tell them to leave. Annie felt the river wind against her back. Richard stopped several feet away. Let her go. Tell them. Thomas had freed himself from Henry and was moving along the opposite side of the platform. Henry remained near the railing, breathing hard and watching for a way out. Annie looked down. The water beneath the platform was shallow near the pilings. Broken boards and rusted chains rose above the surface. Victoria pressed the gun beneath Annie's jaw. You ruined everything. No, Annie said. I delivered a letter. Victoria shoved her closer to the edge. Elizabeth stepped forward. You were exposed because you could not stop talking about what you had done. Annie did not create your guilt. You took my life from me. It was never yours. Victoria released Annie and lunged at Elizabeth. Annie caught Elizabeth's arm and pulled her aside. Victoria's heel struck a patch of oil near the edge. Her foot slipped between two broken boards. She reached for the railing, missed, and fell from the platform. Her scream ended in the water below. Richard rushed to the edge. Victoria surfaced beside a concrete piling, gasping and striking at the water with one arm. Her gun had disappeared. Thomas grabbed a rusted life ring from the wall and threw it toward her. Annie stared at him. You're saving her? She stands trial alive. Victoria caught the ring. Federal agents entered the warehouse as Thomas and two officers pulled her onto the lower dock. Agent Helen Brooks climbed the stairs, ordered Henry to the floor, and placed him in handcuffs. Richard sank against the railing. Elizabeth knelt beside him and pressed both hands over the wound in his shoulder. You came back for me, she said. I should have found you years ago. You found me when someone finally gave you the chance to listen. Agent Brooks approached Annie. Where is the recording device? Annie pointed toward the office. Under the filing cabinet. Brooks gave a brief nod. We received the transmission until the first gunshot. It was enough. Victoria coughed water onto the dock below while an agent secured her wrists. That girl set me up, she shouted. None of this proves anything. Brooks looked down at her. Your own voice proves it. Annie sat beside Elizabeth and unfolded Martha's handkerchief from her pocket. The blue butterfly remained clean despite the dust and blood around them. As dawn began to lighten the river, federal agents led Henry and Victoria toward separate vehicles. Richard watched them go, his face gray with pain. Annie looked across the shipyard at the first light moving over the water. The arrests were over. The harder work repairing what 5 years of silence had broken was only beginning. 1 year later, Annie stood beneath the basketball hoop in her high school gym while the principal struggled to keep the microphone from squealing. Rows of folding chairs covered the polished floor. Families filled the bleachers with flowers, cameras, and handmade signs. The air smelled of floor wax, perfume, and the barbecue smoke drifting in from the parking lot, where several parents had already started preparing food for the graduation party. Annie adjusted the edge of her blue gown and searched the crowd. Martha sat near the front in a lavender dress she had owned for 12 years and worn only to church weddings and funerals. Elizabeth sat on her right. The scar at her temple remained visible, but she no longer lowered her face when strangers looked at it. Richard sat on Martha's other side. His shoulder had healed, though he still moved his right arm carefully when the weather changed. He wore a dark suit without a tie because Martha had told him a high school gym in June was no place for unnecessary clothing. The three of them looked like people who had not planned to become a family but had stopped asking permission. The year since the shipyard had not repaired everything. It had only made repair possible. Victoria Langford had been charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and misuse of charitable funds. The recording from the warehouse matched the financial records from the safe deposit box, the bank cameras, Thomas's garage footage, and testimony from Calvin Ross. Ross had been arrested outside Jacksonville after trying to cross into Georgia under another name. Henry Cole pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. His lawyers argued that Victoria had controlled him through threats and money, but the prosecutors produced 23 years of records showing how often Henry had made his own choices. Thomas Reed testified too. He did not ask for immunity. He admitted that he had found signs of interference with Elizabeth's car and remained silent after Henry threatened his son. The court had not yet decided whether he would face charges, but Thomas told Richard he would accept the result. "I spent 5 years hoping fear would excuse me," he had said. "It doesn't." Richard had not forgiven him. Elizabeth had not either. Still, they both attended the hearing when Thomas gave the federal agents every remaining record in his possession. Forgiveness, Elizabeth often reminded Richard, was not the same as pretending no harm had been done. Annie's name had been cleared within weeks of the arrests, though the damage did not disappear as quickly as the headlines changed. The television stations that had called her a possible fraud issued corrections at the end of their evening broadcasts. The diner manager offered her job back and promised better hours. Annie declined. "I believe you meant well," she told him, "but you believed me only when it became safe." He had no answer. Richard offered her money after the federal hearing. Annie refused that too. "I don't want a reward for telling the truth." "Then call it compensation." "For what?" "For what you lost." She looked at him across Martha's kitchen table. "You can't calculate that for me." Richard learned not to reach for his checkbook every time he felt guilty. Instead, he asked what would help. Annie proposed a scholarship fund for students from East Side and other Charleston neighborhoods, where families were often one car repair or medical bill away from losing everything. She also wanted a legal center that could help residents challenge unfair evictions, wage theft, and false criminal accusations. Richard agreed, but Annie added one condition: "Your name doesn't go on the building." He had looked surprised. "Then whose name does?" "The community chooses." The board eventually named it the Eastside Justice and Learning Center. Half its members came from neighborhood churches, schools, and small businesses. Richard provided funding but held no authority to overrule them. He attended the opening and sat in the third row. No one placed a plaque with his name near the entrance. Martha considered that progress. The principal called another graduate, and applause shook the bleachers. Elizabeth leaned toward Richard. "You're more nervous than she is." "I am not. You've checked the program 6 times. They could have changed the order." Martha glanced between them. "They did not change the alphabet, Mr. Whitmore." Elizabeth smiled. Richard lowered the program. Their life together had not returned to what it had been before the accident. Elizabeth did not move back into the estate. She said the rooms carried too many memories chosen by other people. Richard rented a smaller house 4 blocks from Martha's home. At first he visited Elizabeth for coffee. Then they began taking walks in the evening. Some days they spoke about the 5 missing years. Other days they discussed grocery prices, old movies, and whether Martha put too much salt in her cornbread. One afternoon, Elizabeth had asked him, "What if I never become the woman you remember?" Richard took time before answering. "I don't need you to become who you were. I'd like the chance to know who you are now." She did not promise to return to him. She only took his hand. For Richard, that was enough. Annie Carter, the principal's voice, brought him back to the gym. Martha rose before anyone else. Elizabeth stood with her, followed by Richard and then half the East Side section. Applause spread through the building. Annie crossed the stage, accepted her diploma, and shook the principal's hand. Camera flashes appeared across the bleachers. For a moment she remembered other cameras pointed at her outside Martha's house, when strangers had decided who she was before hearing her speak. These cameras felt different. They belonged to people who knew her name. After the ceremony, families crowded onto the football field. Children ran between graduates while grandparents called instructions no one followed. Tables near the fence held sheet cake, fried chicken, potato salad, and pitchers of sweet tea. Annie found Martha beneath a shade tent. "You did it," Martha said, pulling her into a hug. "We did it." "No, I already graduated. This one belongs to you." Elizabeth embraced Annie next. "Your mother would have been proud." Annie closed her eyes for a moment. "I hope so." She would. Richard waited until the others stepped aside. He held a narrow wooden case. "I have something for you." Annie looked at him. "You know how I feel about expensive gifts. It isn't new." He opened the case. Inside, beneath protective glass, lay the folded letter Annie had carried into the wedding. Elizabeth's handwriting remained clear, and the small blue butterfly rested beneath her name. Annie touched the edge of the frame. Richard said, "That piece of paper saved my life." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Whitmore. The woman who wrote it saved you. I was only the person who refused to let anyone stop me from delivering it." Elizabeth stood beside him. "Sometimes that is what courage looks like." Martha adjusted Annie's graduation cap. "And sometimes courage looks like listening before it is too late." Richard looked at the letter again. He had spent most of his life believing power meant being the person who spoke and others listened. Annie had taught him that power also meant knowing when to become quiet. They walked toward the parking lot together as the late sun settled over Charleston. Martha and Elizabeth moved ahead, arguing about whether Richard had brought enough ice for the cookout. Annie stayed beside him, carrying the framed letter beneath one arm and her diploma beneath the other. Behind them, the gym doors closed on the ceremony. Ahead, people from East Side had filled folding tables with food and saved places for everyone. A small piece of paper could not change the world by itself. But in the hands of someone brave enough to carry it, it could make an empire stop, turn around, and finally read the truth. The story reminds us that truth often comes from the person society is quickest to ignore. Annie had no wealth, status, or influence, yet her courage forced powerful people to face what they had hidden. It also shows that silence can protect injustice, while real loyalty requires honesty, even when the truth is painful. Most importantly, the story teaches that justice is not only about punishing the guilty, it is also about listening to the unheard, taking responsibility, and helping repair the harm that fear, prejudice, and betrayal have caused. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.